I am a 38-year-old mom of three, and my dad, Richard, was never really there for me growing up. After my mom died, he quickly remarried, and I became an outsider in my own home. Years later, he suddenly wanted to play the doting grandpa, but only when there was an audience. When my kids finally told him the truth at a family dinner, everything fell apart. What if the person who was supposed to love you the most only showed up when there was an audience? What if the bonds of family were nothing more than a photo opportunity? This is the story of how a grandfather lost his family, not to tragedy, but to truth. I'm 38, a mother of three, and if there's one lesson life has hammered home, it's this. Family only works when both sides show up. My story isn't the typical tale of betrayal or loss. It's not about a sudden tragedy or a dramatic blowout. It's about the slow, quiet erosion of a relationship, one where the only casualty was the illusion of family. My father, Richard, is 62 now. Growing up, he wasn't a monster. He wasn't abusive, but he wasn't a dad either. He worked long hours, and even when he was home, it felt like he wasn't. I'd ask for help with homework. He was too tired. I'd talk about my day. He'd nod while staring at the TV. He was a man whose comfort always came first, and everything else fell away, including me. When my mom was alive, she was the glue holding everything together. She was warm, present, and everything he wasn't. But when I was 16, she died. And as if he'd just been waiting, Richard moved on quickly. Within a year, Diane entered our lives with her 2 kids. Suddenly, I was a guest in my own home. Diane wasn't evil, but she was loud, opinionated, and focused on appearances. To her, I wasn't a stepdaughter. I was an obstacle. And Richard, well, he didn't just let it happen. He encouraged it. Her kids became his world, and I became the afterthought. There were no fights, no drama, just a quiet acceptance that I wasn't part of the picture anymore. I left when I turned 18. No big scene. I just walked away, found a job, built my life, and met Mark, the man who showed me what family should feel like. We had our 3 kids, and for a long time I barely thought about Richard. He had his life, and I had mine. But then, a few years ago, he started reaching out. At first, I thought maybe it was guilt. Maybe he finally realized what he'd missed. But it became clear quickly that it wasn't about me or my kids. It was about his image. His friends were becoming grandparents, showing off family photos, and suddenly, he wanted that too. Not in a real way, not with love or effort, but in the way that looked good on social media. He made promises to my kids, big ones, trips, special outings, showing up for their events. But almost every time something came up. He forgot birthdays, canceled plans, and when he did show up, it was as if he was only half there. My kids noticed. They asked questions. And yet, Richard expected their admiration just for being around. The breaking point came on a Thursday. He called, wanting the kids for a weekend trip, but they were busy, a school play, a soccer game. When I told him, he exploded. He called me selfish, accused me of turning them against him. And that's when I saw it. He wasn't just a distant father, he was a man who believed his own story so deeply that anything outside of it felt like betrayal. If he wanted to know why my kids didn't see him as a real grandfather, then maybe it was time for him to hear the truth, straight from their mouths. And the perfect opportunity was just around the corner. When I think back to my childhood, it's not the big moments that stand out, it's the emptiness between them. My father, Richard, wasn't the kind of dad you'd find at a school play or cheering on the sidelines of a soccer game. He was more like a shadow, always there, but never really present. He worked long hours, and when he was home, he seemed more interested in escaping into the television than connecting with me. I learned early on that asking for his attention usually led to disappointment. If I needed help with homework, he was too tired. If I wanted to share a story from my day, he'd nod absently, his mind clearly elsewhere. It wasn't that he was outright cruel. There were no harsh words or slamming doors. Instead, it was a quiet kind of neglect, the kind that makes you feel invisible in your own home. My mother was different. She was everything Richard wasn't. Warm, engaged, always there with a hug or a kind word. She was the glue that held our little family together, the buffer that made Richard's indifference manageable. With her around, our home still felt like a home. But when I was 16, everything changed. She died suddenly, and it felt like the walls of our world collapsed in an instant. I remember standing in the kitchen, staring at the empty chair where she used to sit, wondering how we would go on. But while I was drowning, Richard seemed to be treading water just fine. It wasn't long before he started dating again. And within a year, Diane walked through our door, 2 kids in tow, and declared our house her own. Diane wasn't the wicked stepmother from a fairy tale, but she had her own kind of cruelty. She was loud, always quick to share her opinions, and obsessed with how things looked to others. From day one, it was clear that I was more of a leftover than a part of her vision for our new family. Her children became the center of Richard's world. He took them to their soccer games, helped them with their homework, the very things he had never done for me. And I wasn't just pushed aside, I was erased. Diane had this way of making me feel like a guest in my own home. She'd rearrange the furniture, redecorate my room, and plan family outings without even mentioning them to me. Richard didn't just allow it, he encouraged it. He wanted a fresh start, a clean slate, and I was the smudge he couldn't quite wipe away. I stopped trying. I stopped asking for his time, stopped hoping he'd notice me. The house became a place I slept, nothing more. I counted down the days until I turned 18, until I could leave without looking back. And when the day came, I did. Just that. No fights, no dramatic exit. I just packed my things and walked away. I found a job, a small apartment, and a sense of freedom I'd never known. I built my own life, met Mark, and created the family I had always wanted. For a long time, Richard was just a name in my phone, a person I used to know. I didn't think about him. I didn't need to. But sometimes, the ghosts you leave behind find ways to haunt you. And Richard, well, he was about to come knocking, not because he missed me, but because he missed the image of the family he never bothered to build. Walking away from my father's house felt less like leaving and more like escaping. At 18, with nothing but a duffel bag and the weight of years spent feeling invisible, I stepped into the world on my own terms. It wasn't easy. The first apartment I rented was barely more than a shoebox, and my first job wasn't exactly glamorous, but it was mine. Every paycheck, every bill paid, was a reminder that I had built something real, something he couldn't take away. For the first time, I had control over my own story. There were no shadows to live under, no hoops to jump through for the barest scraps of affection. I created routines, found friends, and slowly, piece by piece, put together a life that felt genuine. It was during this time that I met Mark. He was everything Richard wasn't: steady, kind, and present. He listened when I spoke, celebrated my successes, and stood by me during the hard days. We built our life together, one brick at a time. We got married, bought a modest home, and eventually welcomed our 3 kids into the world. With each milestone, I felt further away from the girl who had spent so many years hoping her father would see her. I didn't need his validation anymore. I had my own family, my own happiness, and for a long while, Richard was just a faint echo in the background of my life. I kept contact low. There were the occasional holiday cards, the rare phone call on birthdays, but nothing more. He had his new family, and I had mine. It felt balanced, like an unspoken agreement that we were better off in separate worlds. I thought it would stay that way. I thought I had finally left the past behind. But life has a funny way of circling back. When my oldest turned 10, I started getting more messages from Richard. At first, they seemed harmless enough. How were the kids? What were they into? Could he come by for a visit? I didn't see the pattern at first, but it became clear quickly. He wasn't reaching out because he wanted to know his grandchildren. He was reaching out because his friends were becoming grandparents, and he wanted to keep up. His calls weren't about connection. They were about appearances. He wanted the photo ops, the stories to share at dinner parties, the curated image of a doting grandfather. But when it came to the real work, showing up for school plays, remembering birthdays, being present, he was nowhere to be found. My kids started asking questions, their young minds piecing together the truth faster than I expected. Why didn't Grandpa show up when he promised? Why did he cancel plans last minute? Why did it feel like he only wanted to see them when other people were watching? I tried to shield them from the worst of it, but kids are perceptive. They knew something wasn't right. Still, I thought maybe, just maybe, he'd come around. But every time he had a chance to prove me wrong, he doubled down on proving me right. His attempts to reconnect were like watching someone act in a play, his lines rehearsed, his affection staged. And yet, he seemed to genuinely believe he was the victim in all of this. It wasn't until that phone call, the one where he accused me of turning the kids against him, that I realized he would never change. He had built his own story, where he was the loving father and grandfather, and anything that didn't fit was simply rewritten in his mind. But the truth has a way of slipping through the cracks, and as much as he tried to paint the perfect picture, the reality was starting to show. If he wanted to know why my kids didn't see him as a real grandfather, then it was time for him to hear the truth from their own lips. And as fate would have it, Diane's perfect little family appreciation dinner was right around the corner. When Richard decided to play the role of a loving grandfather, it was as if he had found a new script for his life. His friends were sharing stories of fishing trips and family barbecues, posting pictures of their grandkids on Facebook, and basking in the glow of world's best grandpa mugs. Richard wanted that too, not the relationships, but the recognition. At first, I wanted to believe it was genuine. When he reached out to my kids, I thought maybe, just maybe, he was ready to be present. He started calling more often, asking how the kids were doing, suggesting weekend visits or special outings. But it didn't take long to see through the act. His offers were big, bold promises: trips to the zoo, a weekend at the lake, tickets to a theme park. But almost every time something would come up, plans would change, promises would break, and my kids were left staring at the door, wondering why Grandpa never showed. I tried to manage their expectations. I didn't want to paint him as a villain, but kids aren't dumb. They started noticing the patterns. My 14-year-old asked why Grandpa always canceled. My 12-year-old wondered why he only called when he needed a new photo for his Facebook page. And my 9-year-old, sweet and honest, asked if maybe they'd done something wrong. I assured them it wasn't their fault. It was never their fault. But it's hard to explain to a child that sometimes adults just don't have it in them to be the people they pretend to be. Richard wasn't interested in building bonds. He was interested in building an image. He wanted the kind of relationship you could frame and hang on the wall, not the kind that takes time, patience, and real effort. And yet, in his mind, he was the victim. Every canceled plan was someone else's fault. Every missed birthday was an oversight, never neglect. And when my kids started pulling away, protecting their hearts from his empty promises, he turned his frustration on me. The breaking point came with a phone call. He had planned a weekend getaway with the kids, but they had prior commitments: a school play, a soccer game. I told him they couldn't make it, and he snapped. He called me selfish, accused me of turning them against him, and claimed I was making them cold and ungrateful. His words didn't hurt me. They only confirmed what I already knew. Richard didn't see my kids as real people with their own lives and commitments. He saw them as props in his story, and when they didn't fit, he lashed out. But if he wanted to know why they didn't see him as a real grandfather, I wasn't going to shield him from the truth. It just so happened that Diane was planning her annual family appreciation dinner, a chance to play hostess and show off her perfect blended family. We were rarely invited, but this time I reached out to Diane directly. When she hesitated, I insisted. She extended the invitation, likely not wanting to appear rude, and Richard was thrilled. He thought it was his chance to show off his grandkids, to his friends, to reinforce the story he had been telling. What he didn't realize was that the truth was about to unravel, and he wouldn't be able to control the narrative this time. Before the dinner, I sat my kids down. I told them they didn't owe anyone a performance. If their grandfather asked why they weren't close, they could tell him the truth. No need to be mean, no need to argue, just honesty. They agreed. I wasn't setting him up. I was giving him exactly what he asked for: a chance to understand why the bridge he wanted to cross was no longer there. As we headed to Diane's home, I could feel the weight of what was about to happen. The air felt heavy, charged, like the moments before a storm. But I knew that no matter what came next, it wouldn't be my truth that unraveled his story. it would be his own. Walking into Diane's house for the family appreciation dinner felt like stepping onto a stage where the script had already been written, except I wasn't playing the role they expected. The dining room was a picture of perfection. The table was set with the kind of care that wasn't meant for comfort but for show. The lighting was warm, the silverware gleamed, and Diane floated around the room, greeting guests with her rehearsed smile. Richard was already seated at the head of the table, looking smug and ready for his moment in the spotlight. He wore that same expression I remembered from my childhood, the look of a man who believed his own story so deeply that reality had no place at his table. Diane's 2 adult children were there too, treated like royalty, while my kids and I felt more like extras who had wandered onto the wrong set. We found our seats, and almost immediately, Richard launched into his performance. He introduced my kids to his friends with exaggerated pride, speaking loudly enough for the entire room to hear. He told stories about their accomplishments, stories he wasn't actually present for. He spoke of birthdays he didn't attend, achievements he only knew about from social media. It was clear he was crafting an image, and for a moment, the room seemed to buy it. But then came the questions. Richard, emboldened by his audience, started asking my kids pointed questions. What's your favorite thing about Grandpa? Aren't you excited to spend more time together? It was my 14-year-old who broke the silence. His voice was steady, free from anger or spite. We don't visit because you don't make an effort, he said. You cancel plans and don't even know what sports we play. The room went silent. Richard blinked, the practiced smile slipping just a little. He tried to laugh it off, but my 12-year-old wasn't done. You forgot my birthday 3 years in a row, she said. You only text when you want a picture for Facebook. Her words hung in the air, sharp and undeniable. Diane stiffened. Her grip on her wine glass tightened, and I could almost hear the rehearsed lines she wanted to say. But it was my 9-year-old who delivered the final blow. Quietly, he mumbled, Mom doesn't talk bad about you. We just see it ourselves. His voice was soft, almost apologetic, but the impact was seismic. The perfect dinner scene cracked, and the truth spilled out like shattered glass. Richard's face turned red. For a second, it looked like he might say something real, something genuine. But instead, he went on the defensive. He turned to me, accusing me of poisoning their minds, of raising them to be ungrateful. His voice rose, the calm, grandfatherly persona slipping away, revealing the raw, unvarnished truth beneath. I didn't need to argue. I simply said, they're just telling you how they feel. The truth had already been spoken, and no amount of deflection could erase it. Diane, realizing her perfect family dinner was crumbling, jumped in. She forced a tight smile, trying to steer the conversation back to safer waters. Well, maybe we all need to work harder at staying connected, she said, but the room wasn't listening. The rest of the dinner was a strange charade. Conversations restarted, but the warmth was gone. Richard sulked, barely touching his food. His friends exchanged uncomfortable glances, and even Diane's children seemed eager to leave. When it was finally time to go, Richard didn't say goodbye. He stayed at the table, staring into his untouched plate, a man who had just lost control of his own story. As we left, my 14-year-old leaned in and whispered, "That was embarrassing." For him. I couldn't help but agree. The truth had come out, not with a scream or a fight, but with the quiet honesty of children who had simply seen too much. And as we walked away from that perfect house, I knew this wasn't the end. Because Richard had spent his whole life crafting his story, and now for the first time, the cracks were showing, and I had no doubt he would do everything he could to try and cover them up. The morning after the family appreciation dinner, my phone wouldn't stop buzzing. Diane struck first with a long, angry text. She accused me of letting my kids humiliate Richard in front of his friends, of raising them to be cold and ungrateful. But beneath all the words, her message was clear. I had shattered the illusion of her perfect family. Richard's text came next, short but bitter. He accused me of setting him up, of feeding my kids lies and using the dinner to embarrass him. In his mind, none of this was his fault. It never had been. I didn't argue. I sent back one message. You wanted to know why they don't visit. You got your answer. I thought that would be the end of it, but of course, it wasn't. By noon, extended family members were involved. My aunt texted, saying I had hurt Richard deeply. My uncle suggested family grievances shouldn't be aired at the dinner table. A distant cousin chimed in, suggesting I should have handled things privately. Handled what exactly? My kids had told the truth, nothing more. But in my family, where appearances meant everything, honesty was the real crime. My husband, Mark, just shook his head. They don't like that they can't control the narrative anymore, he said. And he was right. Later that afternoon, Richard called. I let it go to voicemail, but he kept trying. On the third call, I picked up. His tone was calmer, almost careful. He wished I had given him a heads up before the kids confronted him. He said he wanted to make things right, to have another chance to be the grandfather he always claimed to be. I told him the truth. You had 14 years to be a real grandparent. Relationships aren't built on last-minute grand gestures. They're built by showing up. He went quiet. Finally, he muttered, I just don't understand why you're being so difficult. I hung up. That evening, Diane sent another text, full of blame. She accused me of breaking the family apart and demanded an apology. I screenshotted the message, sent it back with a single response. No, this is on him. Richard turned to social media, his Facebook filled with vague posts about how sad it was when children turned on their parents. Diane, of course, was in the comments echoing his sentiments. Some relatives offered sympathy, but others started pushing back. One cousin wrote, funny, considering you forgot my birthday for 10 years straight. Another added, you only care about family when there's an audience. I stayed out of it, but my 14-year-old didn't. He asked if he could respond, and I told him it was up to him. His comment was simple. Grandpa, you don't even know our birthdays. Maybe fix that before calling us ungrateful. That was the moment the narrative slipped out of Richard's control. His comment section exploded. Each time he tried to defend himself, someone else brought up a forgotten birthday, a broken promise, a time he didn't show up. Eventually, he deleted the entire post. But it was too late. Screenshots had already spread through family group chats. For the first time, I wasn't the one carrying the weight of his narrative. For the first time, I felt free. After the Facebook meltdown, I expected Richard to lay low for a while. His attempt to paint himself as the victim had backfired, and even his oldest friends were distancing themselves. But with Richard, nothing ever truly ended. It just simmered. Until the next attempt to rewrite the story. A week later, my cousin sent me a message. Your dad just posted something weird about wanting to do better. I checked through a spare account, and there it was. A new Facebook post, carefully worded and dripping with practiced remorse. This time, his tone had shifted. Gone were the accusations and vague digs. Now it was all about healing and starting fresh. He didn't apologize, didn't acknowledge any specifics, just broad statements about mistakes being made and wanting to reconnect. Diane, of course, was in the comments, playing the supportive wife, saying things like, we just want to be part of our grandkids' lives. The reactions were mixed. Some older relatives bought into it, commenting with, family is everything, and so glad to hear this. But others weren't so quick to buy in. A cousin replied, an apology would be a good start. Another added, you can't just post about healing and expect everything to be fine. Then, just a few hours later, I got a text from Richard. Let's put this behind us. I'd love to take the kids out for ice cream. It was so predictable. I almost laughed. No direct apology, no acknowledgement of what had happened, just an attempt to sweep everything under the rug with a generic offer. But something felt off. He hadn't reached out to my kids directly. He hadn't asked if they were comfortable seeing him again. He just assumed I'd jump at the chance to make everything look normal. I decided to test him. I replied, sure. But let's meet at their soccer game this weekend. You can support them first. His response was almost immediate. I was thinking something more one-on-one. Of course he was. It wasn't about genuinely showing up. It was about controlling the narrative. I pushed again. If you want to be involved, show up for them. Silence. No response. No showing up. Nothing. 3 days later, my 12-year-old checked Richard's Facebook and found a new post. Some people don't want to move forward. I tried, but you can't reason with bitterness. That was it. That was the moment my kids fully saw the truth. Richard didn't actually want to make amends. He just wanted to control the story. And when he couldn't, he retreated to the same old script, casting himself as the misunderstood father, the unfairly shunned grandfather. A month passed with no contact. For the first time in years, there were no guilt-tripping messages, no sudden attempts at damage control. Life moved forward. My kids thrived, and without the constant weight of drama, everything felt lighter. Then, just when I thought it was truly over, Richard tried one last, desperate move. It started with Diane. Out of nowhere, she sent a long, dramatic email. The subject line alone was enough to make me roll my eyes. "You've ruined Richard's last chance to be a grandfather." Inside, it was the same old guilt-tripping. Richard was heartbroken. He might not have many years left, and I was robbing him of precious time with his grandchildren. She accused me of being cold, unforgiving, cruel, all the usual things she said whenever she wasn't getting her way. I considered ignoring it. I really did. But instead, I sent back one question. Then why didn't he show up to the soccer game? Silence, no response, and that told me everything. A day later, Richard himself called. He left a voicemail, his voice full of self-pity. "You're really going to keep my grandkids from me over a few misunderstandings?" I didn't respond. I didn't even listen to the rest of it. I deleted it. A week later, a relative reached out. Apparently, Richard and Diane are complaining to anyone who will listen about how no one visits them anymore. The best part? Even Diane's own kids had started pulling away. The cracks in their perfect image weren't just showing, they were splitting wide open. Without me or my kids, and now with even Diane's stepchildren distancing themselves, Richard was left with no one. His last desperate attempt to control the story had failed. For the first time in my entire life, I was completely free from his manipulations. And it felt incredible. It's strange how freedom feels when it finally arrives. After years of carrying the weight of someone else's narrative, I was finally free. Free from the manipulations, the guilt, the endless attempts to rewrite history. And more importantly, my kids were free too. They no longer had to pretend, to perform, to bend themselves into shapes that fit Richard's story. They could just be themselves. And that was enough. A few weeks after Richard's last attempt to reclaim his narrative, a birthday card arrived. In the mail, it was for my 9-year-old. The handwriting wasn't his, probably Diane's. Inside, there was no personal message, no sign of real connection. Just a generic, "Happy birthday. Grandpa loves you." My son opened it, stared at the card for a moment, and then asked, "Why is Grandpa acting like we're close?" There was no anger in his voice, just genuine confusion. And that was when I knew. My kids didn't feel hurt anymore. They simply didn't care. The hold Richard once had over us was gone. I blocked his number permanently, along with Diane's. No more second chances, no more space for guilt or manipulation. When extended family reached out, trying to play peacemaker, I told them the truth. We're done. This isn't about bitterness. It's about boundaries. Since then, life has moved forward with a clarity I didn't know was possible. My kids are thriving, confident, kind, surrounded by people who show up for them because they want to, not because there's an audience. Mark and I have built a home filled with real love, not the performative kind. And as for Richard and Diane, I heard through the grapevine that their once crowded family appreciation dinners are now mostly empty. Even Diane's own kids have pulled away, worn down by the same hollow routines that once defined my own childhood. It turns out that when you build your life on appearances, all it takes is a little truth to bring it crashing down. And maybe that's the real lesson in all of this. Sometimes the strongest thing you can do isn't fighting to keep a relationship. It's letting it go. It's recognizing that not everyone deserves a place in your story, and that's okay. Family isn't just about blood or titles or traditions. It's about showing up, being present, and loving without conditions. And sometimes, the hardest truth is realizing that the people who should have given you that love never had it to give. But the beauty in that truth, it gives you the chance to build something better, something real. And that's exactly what we did. Sometimes the real loss isn't losing a family member, it's realizing they were never truly there to begin with.